Our episodes deal with serious and often distressing incidents. If you feel at any time you need support, please contact your local crisis centre. For suggested phone numbers for confidential support and for a more detailed list of content warnings, please see the show notes for this episode on your app or on our website. It was getting late on the afternoon of Wednesday, December 7, 1994, and married couple Joy and Roger Membrey were seriously starting to worry. Their daughter, 22-year-old Elisabeth, had been scheduled to attend an important doctor's appointment earlier that day, and they'd been eagerly waiting to hear how it went. For the past year, Elisabeth had been experiencing bouts of severe abdominal pain, and she'd been hoping that this specialist appointment might finally explain why. When Roger called Elisabeth earlier that day to ask how it went, she didn't answer her phone. He left a message on her answering machine, but by 6 p.m, she still hadn't returned his call. Joy tried Elisabeth again. Still no answer. The Membreys' worry only increased after receiving a phone call from Elisabeth's boyfriend, Jason, asking if Elisabeth was with them. Jason said he too had been trying unsuccessfully to get in touch with Elisabeth all day. They'd had dinner plans the previous night that Elisabeth cancelled at the last minute after being asked to work overtime. She worked as a bartender at the Manhattan Hotel, a pub in the outer Melbourne suburb of Ringwood, which was just a short drive from her home. Their anxiety spiking, Roger and Joy Membrey drove past the pub to check if Elisabeth's car was in the car park. Upon seeing it wasn't there, they continued on to Elisabeth's flat in Ringwood East, which was an 8-minute drive away. By the time they arrived, it was nearing 10 p.m. All the lights were off inside, but they were relieved to see Elisabeth's car, a red Mazda hatchback, parked in its usual spot in the driveway. They knocked on the flat's front door. There was no answer. This caused genuine concern for the doting parents. Elisabeth adored her car. She considered it her ticket to independence, and if she planned on going somewhere, there was no way she'd leave it behind without telling anyone her plans. The only explanation the Membreys could think of was that Elisabeth must be sick or injured inside the flat. At that moment, Jason pulled up. The trio examined the property and discovered that one of the windows was slightly ajar. Unsure of what else to do, Jason agreed to break in. With Roger and Joy's help, he slowly managed to shimmy his way inside. The Membreys waited anxiously outside while Jason looked around. Then, they heard his howls. At first glance, Elisabeth's flat looked like it always did. The front door opened to the small living room, which was relatively neat and organised. There were a few haphazard items in the entranceway and clean laundry hanging on a small fold-up clothes horse. The adjoining kitchen was spotless. The only thing out of place was a single-used coffee mug that sat in the sink. But the hallway told a different story. Just outside of Elisabeth's bedroom, a large pool of blood stained the hallway carpet. It looked like someone had tried to mop it up. Jason let the Membreys inside, but between the three of them, it was obvious that Elisabeth wasn't there. The only things that appeared to be missing were Elisabeth's doona, her black leather purse, her house keys, and her car keys. The Membreys didn't know what to think. With everything else in the flat appearing normal, the only explanation they could think of was that Elisabeth had been badly injured. Frantically, they started calling nearby hospitals, asking whether their daughter had been admitted as a patient. When none of the hospitals answered in the affirmative, Roger called the police. By 11 p.m, uniformed officers from Ringwood's Criminal Investigation Branch arrived at the flat. Inspecting the scene, it was clear to them that the blood in the hallway had been there for some time. It had been a swelteringly hot day in Melbourne, with the temperature soaring to almost 40 degrees Celsius, and the blood had dried brown. But the police also noticed some things that the Membreys had missed. Inside the flat was a bucket filled with wet rags. The toilet paper holder was also missing, and there was no toilet paper anywhere in the house. It was obvious that someone had tried to clean up the scene. Some portions of the hallway wall had been wiped down, but not thoroughly. Down low, just above the skirting boards, several small spatters of blood remained. Despite the blood, there was no evidence of forced entry or signs of a struggle, and the police weren't able to ascertain what had happened inside the flat. Elisabeth's case was handed to the Missing Persons Unit, who wanted to learn more about the 22-year-old. As far as Roger and Joy Membrey were concerned, Elisabeth was everything they'd ever wanted in a daughter. As the only girl and youngest in a family of 3 children, Elisabeth had grown up to be an independent, sociable and friendly young woman. She had a joyful laugh and curly dark hair, and people naturally gravitated to her. That was what made her such a good fit at the Manhattan Hotel, where she was liked by customers and co-workers alike. But the bartender gig was just temporary. Elisabeth had recently graduated from La Trobe University with a degree in politics and was pursuing a career in journalism. Passionate and idealistic about current affairs, she often wrote to the Age newspaper to express her views on a range of topics. So the Japanese aren't playing it fair in trade relations with the US, she'd written to the editor earlier that year. Surely it's time someone started playing the Americans at their own dirty game. In another, she voiced her disappointment in the lack of services available for people with mental illness, stating, "It is about time that the issue of mental health is properly addressed in this country." Elisabeth had dreamed of one day being a broadcast journalist and was taking steps to make that happen, having recently applied for a position with commercial television network Channel 10. Not only was her future looking bright, but she had great relationships with her parents and her boyfriend, and a solid network of close friends. The Membreys assured investigators that Elisabeth had no enemies, wasn't involved in anything nefarious, and there was no one who could possibly wish her harm. Hoping to piece together Elisabeth's last known movements, the police began door-knocking homes in the area. They also set up a caravan opposite Elisabeth's flat where people could report anything they thought might be helpful. The street that Elisabeth lived on, Bedford Road, was a busy thoroughfare, and because the night she went missing had been such a hot one, police were hopeful that more people might have been out than usual. Maybe someone had witnessed something significant. An old school friend of Elisabeth's reported having seen her at the Ringwood Aquatic Centre at around 10 a.m. on the day before she went missing. Elisabeth had gone for a swim and chatted to a man whom she appeared to know. He was described as tall, athletically built and good-looking, with tanned skin and sandy hair shaved at the back and sides, but thicker on top. A member of the public had also seen Elisabeth at the pool that day, recognising her from an article about her disappearance. He told the police that Elisabeth had been in the water when he noticed a man standing at the side of the pool verbally abusing her, quote, "like you wouldn't believe." Horrified by the language the man was using, the concerned citizen considered stepping in, but the man, who matched the description provided by Elisabeth's school friend, abruptly walked away with a distinct limp. A few hours after this encounter, one of Elisabeth's neighbours was on their way to run an errand when they reportedly saw Elisabeth standing in the driveway of her unit, arguing with a man. The two were loading shopping bags into the boot of a blue Holden Gemini when Elisabeth turned and stormed into her unit, with the man following behind. The neighbour only saw them from a distance and therefore didn't notice any distinguishing characteristics, but she described the man as being solidly built, around 6 feet tall, with light brown hair. Later that afternoon, the local postie saw Elisabeth in the street and they had a brief chat. The postie didn't notice anything unusual about Elisabeth or her behaviour, telling the police that she was her typical friendly self. Investigators also spoke to Elisabeth's co-workers at the Manhattan Hotel. Despite its ambitious name, the Manhattan was a working-class pub that attracted what journalist Ian Munro described as a clientele of hard-drinking, knockabout types. On the evening of Tuesday, December 6, Elisabeth was scheduled to work at the Manhattan from 5 until 8:30 p.m, after which she was supposed to have dinner with her boyfriend Jason and his parents. But it had been a busy evening, and as she was nearing the end of her shift, her manager asked if she could stay until closing time. Elisabeth had called Jason from work to let him know about the change of plans. Neither Jason nor any of the Manhattan staff noticed anything unusual about Elisabeth's behaviour that night, and she didn't report any issues with any of the patrons. She clocked off at 11:45 p.m. and drove the short journey home. Police could tell that she'd arrived there safely because her car and work clothes were found at the unit. The only item of clothing that appeared to be missing was a white t-shirt that Elisabeth often wore to bed, indicating she'd changed into that upon returning home from work. What happened between then and when her parents arrived at her flat the following night remained unknown. A woman named Andrea lived with her 2 poodles in the adjoining unit to Elisabeth's. She told police that at around 1:30 a.m. on Wednesday, December 7, her typically quiet dogs started barking incessantly at the fence that separated the 2 properties. Andrea had gone outside to try and calm them down. Shortly after, she heard a loud bang from Elisabeth's unit. She peered outside and noticed an old white car parked near the front gate. Andrea didn't know exactly what make or model the car was, but suggested it could have been a Toyota Celica or something similar. It was dirty, with 4 round headlights, and its front grille appeared to be missing. She went back to bed, and when she left for work around 7 a.m, the white car was gone. But something significant had happened during the time that Andrea went back to sleep. At around 3:30 a.m, a milkman was doing his early morning rounds when he noticed that Elisabeth's red Mazda hatchback had been backed up to the front door of her unit. Around that same time, a truck driver passed Elisabeth's unit and saw what he believed to be a small powder blue sedan, possibly a Datsun, exit the driveway and erratically enter Bedford Road. Another motorist was travelling through the area sometime between 3:45 and 4:15 a.m. when they saw a red hatchback driving unusually slowly on Bedford Road. They caught a quick glimpse inside and saw that a lone male was behind the wheel. At around 4:45 a.m, another witness reported seeing a white 2-door sports car parked across Elisabeth's driveway. A forensic examination of Elisabeth's car revealed traces of blood on the back seat. There was also soil and dust wedged in the wheel trim and doors, which none of Elisabeth's loved ones could explain. They described her as a city girl who drove exclusively on sealed bitumen roads. Armed with these reported sightings, the police's priority was to identify the man Elisabeth was seen arguing with the day before she went missing. Descriptions of the person she'd been talking to at the aquatic centre were strikingly similar to the one she was seen arguing with in her driveway a few hours later. Yet, none of Elisabeth's close friends or family had any idea who he could be. Police couldn't even be certain if both encounters involved the same man or two separate individuals. Elisabeth was a prolific diary writer who recorded everything that was going on in her life. But when police obtained her diaries, they found nothing to suggest this man's identity. Elisabeth hadn't mentioned having any altercations with anyone, nor had she voiced any concerns over anything else going on in her life. But one detail was giving the police serious pause. Elisabeth didn't live alone, but with a close friend named Justine, not her real name. The two had known each other for years and were members of the same dance club. However, in the days leading up to Elisabeth's disappearance, Justine had broken her ankle in a horse riding accident and gone to stay with her boyfriend on the Mornington Peninsula. Unable to drive, she had left her car parked outside of the unit alongside Elisabeth's Mazda. Not many people knew about this, meaning that to the naked eye, it would have appeared that at least two people were home on the night that Elisabeth went missing. If someone had gone to the unit with the intention of harming Elisabeth, it therefore stood to reason that they knew she would be home alone. On her bed, police had found a half-written letter to a friend in England. They theorised that Elisabeth could have been in the middle of writing the letter when she was interrupted by a knock at the door. Recognising the visitor, she let them inside. Alternatively, it was also possible that the offender was already inside the house when she arrived home and had been laying in wait. Regardless of how they got in, police believed Elisabeth was likely caught off guard when the offender launched a fatal attack in the hallway, as there were no signs of a struggle. They didn't think it was a planned attack, but more a spur-of-the-moment situation. In a bid to cover up what he'd done, the offender then used the doona from Elisabeth's bed to transport her body to the back seat of her own Mazda, which he then drove on a dirt road until finding a suitable location to dispose of her body. Afterwards, he spent a considerable amount of time cleaning up the crime scene before fleeing in the early morning hours. With two cars spotted in the area over a period of around 3 hours, a white sedan as well as a blue one, it was also possible that the offender had been helped by an accomplice. As police continued interviewing co-workers from the Manhattan Hotel, it emerged that a bouncer who worked at the pub called Bruce Simpson, not his real name, had a crush of sorts on Elisabeth. Some thought it went beyond that, describing Simpson as obsessed with Elisabeth. Having recently come out of a violent and volatile marriage, he even referred to her as his substitute wife to some. Simpson liked to joke around with Elisabeth, but he'd recently taken things too far with what he considered to be a prank that she didn't find funny. Elisabeth had been standing with her hands behind her back when Simpson came up behind her and placed his testicles in her hands. On the night of Tuesday, December 6, Bruce Simpson had been at the Manhattan, not as an employee, but a patron. 2 days into the investigation into Elisabeth's disappearance, he voluntarily presented himself to the Ringwood police station after word got out that the cops were looking for him. Simpson told the police that he'd been drinking at the Manhattan on Tuesday night with his female housemate. He said they went home at around midnight and didn't leave their house again. Police were skeptical, particularly because they'd already spoken to Simpson's ex-wife, who told them that he had been fixated on Elisabeth. They arranged for a tap on his home phone and closely monitored his movements while focusing on the more pressing matter at hand, finding Elisabeth. After a week passed with no sign of Elisabeth, The case was handed over to the homicide squad, who explained their working theory to the public for the first time. A spokesperson for the missing person unit told reporters, "The background we have on Elisabeth cannot identify anyone who would wish her harm. She is an extremely intelligent and well-liked young woman." This was backed by a homicide squad detective who stated, "There is no reason at all to believe that anyone would want to do Elisabeth harm. We think she was most likely an innocent victim." For Elisabeth's parents, Joy and Roger Membrey, the reality that Elisabeth's disappearance was now considered a homicide was difficult to comprehend. Despite the evidence that had been uncovered so far, the Membreys had been clinging to hope that Elisabeth would be found alive. Until anything was confirmed, they refused to think otherwise. A distraught Joy made an emotional appeal to the public, saying, "If there is anyone out there hurting her, she doesn't deserve it. She is such a caring, lovely girl. She has never hurt anyone." Based on the information gathered so far, police believed that Elisabeth's killer likely frequented either the Manhattan Hotel or the Ringwood Aquatic Centre, and that they had free time during the day. Their decision to transport Elisabeth's body using her own car also indicated a basic knowledge of forensics. Scientific analysis of the soil recovered from Elisabeth's car identified two potential origins, both within an hour's drive of Melbourne. The first was King Lake, a town approximately 50 kilometres north of Ringwood, which is primarily composed of forest and farmland, and is gateway to the King Lake National Park. The second location was Sylvan, a farming area 25 kilometres east of Ringwood, notable for the Sylvan Reservoir and its surrounding eucalyptus forest. Based on these findings, the police concluded that Elisabeth's body was within a 100-kilometre radius of Melbourne. With King Lake National Park alone covering a radius of 57,000 acres, this barely narrowed things down, but the locations were a clue within themselves. The homicide detectives knew that killers typically hide their victims in areas they are familiar with, so it stood to reason that Elisabeth's killer had some kind of connection to one of these locations. One of the big unanswered questions was whether Elisabeth voluntarily let the offender inside or whether they had broken in. Due to how hot it had been on the night she went missing, Elisabeth had left some of the windows to her unit open. It was possible that the offender had gained access this way. Elisabeth's housemate, Justine, also said that some of the windows didn't lock properly and that she had easily broken in herself on several occasions after accidentally locking herself out. There was also the question of whether anyone else might have a key to the unit. Justine had been planning on moving out later that month and had arranged for a friend to pick up some of her furniture, but she couldn't recall whether or not she had given them a key. Elisabeth's boyfriend, Jason, told the police that he'd once gone to the unit when Elisabeth wasn't home. Painters had been working on the outside of the building at the time and had told Jason where he could find a key hidden in the backyard. While it was possible that the offender knew where this key was hidden, police were convinced it was more likely that Elisabeth knew her killer and had let them inside. But given the late hour of their visit, the question was, who would she have felt comfortable enough to open the door for? On Saturday, December 17, the telephone intercept on Bruce Simpson's home phone picked up something of interest. During a phone conversation with an associate named Barry, Simpson said that he'd been, quote, hassled to the max over Liz going missing. He asked Barry if the police had spoken to him, adding reassuringly, "You're all right. I haven't told the police that I came to your joint late that night." This was significant because Simpson had told the police that after he'd returned home from the Manhattan around midnight, he hadn't left again. Catching him in a lie, the police spoke to Bruce Simpson again 2 days later. He came clean, admitting that the real reason he'd been at the Manhattan on December 6 was because he was looking for Barry. Barry was his drug dealer, and he was hoping to score some cannabis. Unable to find him at the pub, Simpson said he and his housemate Jenny returned home at midnight, but he then left the house alone at around 2 a.m. to drive to Barry's to buy the drugs. He said the reason he didn't tell police this at the start was because he didn't want to get Barry in trouble. Simpson's admission only increased police suspicion, as the drive to Barry's put him within closer proximity to Elisabeth's unit. They spoke to Barry, who said he'd been so drunk and stoned on the night in question that he didn't remember a thing. But Simpson's housemate, Jenny, backed his story. She said Simpson was only gone for 20 or 30 minutes, and that they smoked the cannabis together upon his return before retiring to their separate bedrooms. With Elisabeth's killer believed to have spent hours at her unit, Jenny's alibi essentially cleared Simpson, but the police weren't fully convinced. He quickly rose to the position of prime suspect. Then, another call came through that caught their attention. A member of the public urged the police to look into a man named Shane Bond. He claimed that Bond was a regular at the Manhattan who drove an old white Datsun coupe and had a proven history of violence towards women. According to the tipster, Bond had once followed an ex-girlfriend home and bashed her new boyfriend in a jealous rage, landing him with a conviction. What's more, his ex-girlfriend resembled Elisabeth, and she too worked in a bar. He also walked with a limp, which was the result of an indoor cricket injury. Police spoke to Shane Bond on Thursday, December 22. He said he didn't recall what he had been doing on the night of Tuesday, December 6, but denied being at the Manhattan Hotel. Bond said he only drank there on Saturdays during the football season, which had ended months prior, and that although he'd seen Elisabeth working there before, he didn't know her and they'd never spoken. While the police were speaking to Bond, they couldn't help but notice that despite his limp and strong build, he didn't match the description of the man seen arguing with Elisabeth on the day she went missing. He also had deep acne scars on his face, a distinctive feature that none of the witnesses had noted. Police therefore ruled Bond out as a suspect and continued with their investigation. They were interested in speaking to the younger brother of Elisabeth's housemate Justine, 19-year-old Andrew Crump. He still lived with his parents, who were among the few people who knew that Justine was staying with her boyfriend at the time Elisabeth went missing. But when police reached out to Crump in late December, they were told that he and a friend had made the impromptu decision to move to Queensland on Saturday, December 17, just 10 days after Elisabeth went missing. Police tracked Andrew Crump down and spoke to him on the phone. He said the last time he'd been at the Bedford Road unit was a week or two before Elisabeth went missing. According to Crump, he'd stopped in to visit his sister, but she wasn't at home, so Elisabeth had let him in to use the toilet and make a phone call. He didn't have anything useful to add to the investigation. As the weeks ticked by, the list of persons of interest grew, but the police were no closer to finding Elisabeth or her killer. To add insult to injury for the Membrey family, as December came to a close, Elisabeth received the dream job offer from Channel 10 that she'd been hoping for, serving as a painful reminder of the potential that had been ripped from her. By May 1995, there still hadn't been any major breakthroughs in the case, and searches had revealed no sign of Elisabeth's body. Police announced a $100,000 reward for any information that led to an arrest, the largest ever reward in Victorian history at that time. And with that, the tips started trickling in. As the unsolved murder of Elisabeth Membrey continued to put residents of Melbourne on edge, the rumour mill swung into overdrive. One woman came forward to report that a man she knew had threatened her with the warning that he would, quote, "do exactly the same to you that I did to Elisabeth Membrey." This man, who lived locally and was a known methamphetamine user, had also allegedly made a comment suggesting he had thrown Elisabeth's body down a mine shaft. Police looked into him but deemed him an unlikely suspect. At about 6'3" with a goatee and visible tattoos, nothing about him fit the bill of the man Elisabeth had been seen arguing with. One of his friends also labelled him a bullshit artist, suggesting the claims he made about Elisabeth were complete lies. In September 1995, a woman called Crime Stoppers to report something she'd heard on the grapevine. Apparently, around the time that Elisabeth was killed, a man named either Shane or Sean was rumoured to have had blood all over his walls. His explanation for the blood was that he'd bitten his tongue while having an epileptic fit. Detectives went to interview this tipster, but she refused to name her source. They assumed she was talking about Shane Bond, a customer at the Manhattan whose name had previously been put forward by another member of the public. The detectives looked into Bond and noted that he'd moved since they'd spoken to him in December 1994. His current whereabouts were unknown. But having already questioned him, and with no mention of there being any blood on his walls at the time, the detectives dismissed the tip-off. While investigators continued to work tirelessly on the case, by the first anniversary of the crime, they were no closer to a resolution. On Thursday, December 7, 1995, the Membreys once again appealed for help from the public, with Roger telling reporters, "We have to believe it's most probable that Elisabeth was murdered on the night 12 months ago in her unit. However, it's difficult for us to come to terms with that without having some evidence to support it. We just need a resolution as to what actually happened, and then we can move to the next day." Behind the scenes, the wheels continued to turn and tip-offs continued to trickle in. In September 1996, the police announced that they'd made a breakthrough after a woman came forward to provide further information about the white sedan that was seen out the front of Elisabeth's unit on the night she went missing. Newspapers reported that the car had been identified as a mid-1970s model white Datsun 240K that was in need of repair. The front grille or surrounds of the headlights might have been missing, and the number plates were more recent than would typically be seen on a 1970s vehicle. The police also released a sketch of the man Elisabeth was reportedly seen arguing with on the day of her disappearance. Luke Ford, not his real name, was reading the newspaper when he recognised himself as fitting the suspect's sketch. He also owned a white Datsun 240K, like the one described in the article. Ford contacted the police to identify himself and agreed to be interviewed. But the truth was, police already had their eye on Ford. It had emerged that he'd lived in the unit on Bedford Road before Elisabeth and Justine moved in, and that in December 1994, he still had a key to the back door. Since moving out, he'd maintained a relationship with the woman who lived next door. Ford also had a criminal record that included offences for assault, intentionally causing injury, theft, and deception. Coincidentally, he'd also worked at the Manhattan Hotel years earlier, before Elisabeth did, and still drank there from time to time. Perhaps most noteworthy of all was the fact that after Elisabeth's disappearance, he'd reportedly hand-painted his white Datsun black. But Luke Ford told the police that he'd never met Elisabeth. Asked as to his whereabouts on the night of her disappearance, he said he'd been at his girlfriend's house. Although police had no evidence to suggest otherwise, they remained suspicious of Ford. He wasn't the only name on their list that continued to crop up. Throughout 1996 and 97, multiple people came forward to say that Andrew Crump, the brother of Elisabeth's housemate, had made a series of incriminating statements over the years. According to more than 6 reports, Crump told some people that he was at the unit on the night Elisabeth was killed and saw who was responsible. He'd supposedly told others that, quote, Liz is in a safe place, and police wouldn't find her body because it was in an area of thick bush. One relative told the police that when Crump was asked about Elisabeth, he said, "She's in a river." There were other things about Andrew Crump that concerned investigators. During a follow-up interview in August 1995, he told police that he once had to move Elisabeth's car because it was blocking his sister's vehicle. But Justine told the police this never happened. Their unit had space for 3 cars with direct street access, and there had never been a circumstance where she would have had to ask Crump to move either vehicle. According to information later released by the Sydney Morning Herald, Crump had also been accused of a series of small burglaries in the area around the time of Elisabeth's disappearance. A woman who'd lived on his street also claimed she once woke up to find him standing in her bedroom doorway. The police questioned Andrew Crump again in late January 1997. Asked where he was on the night Elisabeth went missing, Crump said he'd been at his parents' house. The next day, he had gone to visit a friend who lived near Bedford Road, but they hadn't been home, so he went to the nearby Bedford Road shops. Crump said he knew someone who worked at the hairdressing salon there, but he soon left because she was too busy to meet with him. He added that while he was at the shops, he noticed 2 men walking near Elisabeth and Justine's unit. One was wearing a t-shirt with an eagle on it that he thought could be a Harley-Davidson motorcycle shirt. The men then got into a maroon-coloured sedan. The police visited the staff who had been working at the Bedford Road hairdressing salon on Wednesday, December 7, 1994, and showed them a picture of Andrew Crump. Nobody recognised him. They also spoke to a woman who claimed that she'd been in Crump's car shortly after he left Melbourne to move to Queensland and had found a black leather purse in the glove box. According to this woman, she asked Crump who the purse belonged to, and he said a friend named Liz. While these factors were indeed suspicious, the police had no evidence to implicate Andrew Crump, and they mostly palmed off his incriminating comments as trivial. If anything, they thought he was just seeking attention. By August 1999, the unsolved case was approaching its 5th anniversary, and still the Membrey family were no closer to finding the answers they so desperately sought. For Elisabeth's parents, Roger and Joy, one of the biggest struggles they faced was not knowing where their daughter's body was. They felt robbed of their right to give Elisabeth a proper burial and have somewhere they could go to honour her. In the lead-up to Australia's Missing Persons Week that year, Roger and Joy proposed that a memorial garden be established within Melbourne's Carlton Gardens for those who shared their experience of ambiguous loss. They wanted to create a tranquil space where people could go to reflect and remember their loved ones when they didn't have anywhere else to do so. With financial backing from a private philanthropic organisation, the garden went ahead and was opened by the state premier as a group of homing pigeons were released into the sky. A park bench overlooked a serene lily pond with a plaque that declared, "A special place for those with missing persons." Joy Membrey told reporters that their unresolved grieving had no end. "We are left in the anger stage," she said. "We are intensely angry that because of somebody's cowardly act, they have deprived us of the normal human right to have a funeral and a place to place flowers. You've got to have somewhere that's yours that you can come to, like a cemetery. This is second best, but it's better than having nothing at all. With no breakthroughs by the year 2000, the case was handed over to Detective Senior Sergeant Ron Iddles to see if fresh eyes could identify something that the original investigators might have missed. Detective Iddles believed the answer to who killed Elisabeth Membrey had probably been staring police in the face all along. As he later told the Sydney Morning Herald, "The answer is always in the file, and quite often we have already spoken to him." Police suspicion remained on some of the names that had come up early in the investigation, including Bruce Simpson, Luke Ford, and Andrew Crump, but there wasn't a single piece of physical evidence to link any of them to the crime. With no answers forthcoming by August 2000, a coronial inquest was held to clarify the circumstances surrounding Elisabeth's death. When the coroner handed down their findings on Tuesday, August 29, all they were able to determine was that Elisabeth had died by an unknown cause at her Ringwood unit on December 7, 1994. On the state of the available evidence, the coroner formally concluded, "I am unable to identify the person or persons who contributed to the death of the deceased." But the inquest reignited public interest in Elisabeth's case, and new tips started to come in. One individual reported information that led the police to search for Elisabeth's body in Ringwood Lake, but nothing of interest was found. DNA samples were obtained from several persons of interest and compared against some cigarette butts that were found in Elisabeth's car. However, none of the profiles matched. While the coroner had been unable to highlight a prime suspect in Elisabeth's murder, the homicide squad's suspicions remained on Bruce Simpson, the bouncer who had allegedly been obsessed with Elisabeth. Unconvinced of the alibi provided for him by his then housemate Jenny, Detective Iddles decided to poke around a bit to see if he could find any cracks in Jenny's story. It soon emerged that a friend of Jenny's named Naomi had her own questions about Bruce Simpson's possible involvement. Naomi told the police that Jenny had given her the same story about the night of Elisabeth's disappearance, saying that Simpson briefly went out to buy cannabis and the two then smoked together before going to bed in separate rooms. But while Jenny had told the police that Simpson hadn't left the house again after that, she'd told Naomi she wasn't so sure. According to Naomi, Jenny was worried that Simpson might have left the house after she fell asleep. The very thought made her visibly distressed. Knowing that the police were sniffing around for information, Jenny allegedly reasoned, "If they break me, they break the case, and that is why the police are going for me." These comments led Naomi to believe that Simpson might have killed Elisabeth, and she told Jenny as much. Jenny allegedly responded, "Whoever did it never meant to do it." Investigators became increasingly suspicious of Jenny's story after finding out that she'd told Naomi that the police had shown her photos of the crime scene when they had never done any such thing. By 2003, Detective Iddles was convinced that Jenny knew more about Elisabeth Membrey's disappearance than she was letting on. In the hopes of encouraging her to come clean, Jenny was charged with attempting to pervert the course of justice. But she stuck by the alibi she had provided for Simpson, saying the comment she had made to Naomi about breaking her to break the case had been misconstrued. According to Jenny, what she meant was that the police must think that if they crack her, they'd crack the case. It was the only reason she could think of to justify their ongoing interest in her. The magistrate ultimately threw the case against Jenny out after finding insufficient evidence to proceed with the charges, but that didn't lessen the police interest in Bruce Simpson. They commenced an undercover operation using what's known as the Mr. Big technique, an elaborate and sometimes controversial covert policing method that aims to extract confessions from suspects in serious crimes where forensic evidence is lacking. An example of how the Mr. Big method was used to catch a killer can be heard in episode 54 of Casefile, which covers the murder of Queensland schoolboy Daniel Morcombe. A similar undercover operation was also orchestrated against Luke Ford, the former tenant of Elisabeth's unit who reportedly still had a key at the time she went missing. While all this was going on, investigators also took another look at Andrew Crump, the brother of Elisabeth's housemate. They were particularly interested in why he had left Melbourne so quickly after Elisabeth's disappearance and examined the circumstances leading up to that trip. Crump had driven to Queensland with a friend of his named Frank. According to Frank, just before they left Melbourne, Crump said there was something he needed to do first. He claimed that his boss had asked him to fill a hole and said that he'd be back soon. Frank told police that Crump then went away and returned about 45 minutes later. He didn't recall any other details about the hole or where it was supposedly located. At the time of Elisabeth's disappearance, Andrew Crump had been an apprentice plumber. The police tracked down his former employer to see if they could verify his story, but they had no knowledge of any such hole. In fact, Crump hadn't even been actively working for them at the time. He'd been on work cover since 1992 after sustaining a workplace injury. Again, while these details were intriguing, they didn't shed any further light for the police. Over the years, they'd questioned Andrew Crump numerous times and had tested his DNA against the cigarette butts found in Elisabeth's car, and still they hadn't found a single piece of evidence to link him to the crime. By 2005, the homicide squad felt confident enough to eliminate him as a suspect. The undercover operations against Bruce Simpson and Luke Ford had also failed to garner any incriminating evidence, and after 10 years, they too were discounted as possible suspects without any charges ever being laid against them. The fact that Elisabeth's murder had gone unsolved for over a decade was difficult for her family to accept. Looking for a way to unleash the rage and frustration she constantly carried inside her, Joy Membrey installed a punching bag in her backyard and took to pounding it anytime she needed a release. As she later told journalist John Sylvester, she eventually had to give this up after permanently damaging 3 of her fingers from overuse. Despite their lack of breakthroughs, the homicide squad was not sitting idly by. By 2006, Detective Iddles and his team had reviewed almost 1,000 pieces of information and interviewed around 3,000 people, though they were still no closer to making an arrest. On Friday, January 6, 2006, the police announced that the existing reward for information relating to Elisabeth's murder was being increased to $1 million. They also said that the Office of Public Prosecutions would consider indemnity for anyone who had acted as an accessory to the murder but had not committed the principal crime themselves. Desperate to solve the case and bring relief to the Membrey family, Detective Iddles told reporters, "There are people in the community who believe we know who is responsible. The reality is, we don't. We're no closer than day one." Later that day, the police received a call. The man on the other line said this wasn't the first time he'd made contact with the police to name this particular individual, but he was adamant that the lead needed to be looked into more thoroughly. The name he put forward was Shane Bond. According to the tipster, word had it that on the night Elisabeth went missing, Bond had come home covered in blood. Detective Iddles reviewed the case file and discovered that Shane Bond had been nominated as a person of interest 6 times over the years. In addition to this most recent claim, there was also the tip-off from a woman back in 1995 who claimed that the walls of Bond's flat had been covered in blood at the time Elisabeth went missing. However, because Bond had been spoken to just 2 weeks after Elisabeth disappeared, any new information that had come in afterwards wasn't looked at. As Iddles later explained to the Sydney Morning Herald, he was seen as eliminated, but he was never eliminated. A detective was assigned to look into the claims that Shane Bond had returned home covered in blood on the night in question. In 2007, he tracked down Bond's former housemate, a man with a criminal record of his own. The housemate told police that in the early morning hours of Wednesday, December 7, 1994, he'd awoken to the sound of the front door being slammed. He got up to see what was going on and went into Bond's bedroom. According to this witness, Bond was standing in the corner of the room, coated in blood from head to toe. Bond explained that he'd had an epileptic fit, during which he'd bitten his tongue. The housemate didn't believe him. There was too much blood for that to be the case, and he assumed that Bond had probably been in a fight. Then, the next day, Bond apparently told his housemate that he was in trouble, quote, over the Elisabeth Membrey thing, and had to leave. As far as the housemate was concerned, Bond had a habit of lying, and he therefore didn't think to tell the police about any of this. But he did spread the word to others in his circle, who had then taken it upon themselves to come forward and to nominate Bond as a person of interest. The police looked into Shane Bond's movements from the time and discovered that his Medicare card had been used to see a doctor in the Queensland town of Caboolture 2 days after Elisabeth went missing. While this supported the notion that Bond left the state in the days following the crime, the records from that practitioner had been destroyed in a fire, and police therefore weren't able to establish what he had sought medical attention for. The police became interested in Shane Bond. Very interested. That interest only grew after a woman named Rochelle, who knew Bond from high school, discovered that he was being looked into and came forward with a story of her own. Rochelle claimed that she had been drinking at the Manhattan Hotel about a week before Elisabeth went missing. As a regular at the pub, she knew Elisabeth to be bubbly and friendly, but on this particular evening, she had seemed out of sorts. Rochelle said she asked Elisabeth what was wrong, and after a bit of probing, she admitted that Shane Bond had been hassling her for a date and wouldn't leave her alone. Knowing Bond personally, Rochelle recommended that Elisabeth tell him to fuck off. Elisabeth seemed unsure. She asked if she should do it, and Rochelle responded, "Yes, I honestly think you should." Rochelle claimed that as soon as she found out Elisabeth was missing, she immediately suspected that Shane Bond could be involved. But she never told anyone about their conversation, fearful that she could have inadvertently played a role in whatever happened to Elisabeth because of what she'd told her to do. When the police spoke to Shane Bond 2 weeks after Elisabeth went missing, he claimed that it had been a couple of months since he'd been at the Manhattan Hotel, and that while he'd seen Elisabeth working there before, he didn't know her personally. Rochelle's tip-off brought all of that into question. And there were other suspicious factors too. Old co-workers of Bond's claimed that he'd abruptly stopped drinking at the Manhattan after Elisabeth went missing, and had even avoided a function that had been thrown there shortly after. The owner of a house where Bond was a boarder in 1997 told the police she was cleaning up after him one day when she found a news article about Elisabeth Membrey. The accompanying photo of Elisabeth had its eyes gouged out. Another witness said that he'd been watching the TV news with Bond when a story about the search for Elisabeth's body came on. Bond apparently remarked that he had known Elisabeth, adding that he'd gone to the Manhattan Hotel on the night she went missing and they'd gotten into a fight. With all this information coming to light, Shane Bond quickly became the investigation's #1 focus. By 2007, he was no longer living in Melbourne, but was working in the mining industry in Western Australia's Pilbara region. A detective travelled to the Pilbara to see what he could uncover. Several co-workers who'd spent time with Bond in the mining camps revealed that he had made some comments that further invalidated the story he told police back in December 1994. A former workmate of Bond's claimed to have once overheard him telling someone about a bartender from Melbourne whom he tried to pick up in a pub. Later, they'd gone back to one of their houses for a drink, and Bond had tried to make a move on her. The woman wasn't interested, and she'd hit Bond, which triggered him to punch her hard enough that she fell over and smashed her head on a coffee table. Bond allegedly said that somebody else had then helped him dispose of the woman's body in a river somewhere. Another person shared a contrasting story in which Bond told them that Elisabeth had had her throat slit. A man named Kevin told police that he'd recently asked Bond what he knew about the Elisabeth Membrey case after finding out that the cops were in the Pilbara investigating the crime. At first, Bond palmed Kevin off, saying he knew nothing. But later on, over a few beers, he allegedly told Kevin that he'd been seeing Elisabeth for a few weeks before she went missing. Bond apparently said that the police were interested in him because he'd been drinking at the Manhattan on the night Elisabeth was last seen alive. Kevin said that Bond told him that Elisabeth had been bashed, and while he made it clear he had nothing to do with it, the conversation left Kevin feeling a little shaken. He was struck by the way Bond seemed to remember the incident like it was yesterday. And there was one comment in particular that he couldn't get out of his mind. Bond had apparently told him, "It doesn't matter anyway. They will never find the body." With so many contrasting stories, it was difficult for the police to know which ones held weight. They placed a tap on Bond's phone, hoping that the increased heat would encourage him to say something incriminating. A friend of Bond's called to let him know that the police had been to see him about Elisabeth's case. He said that he'd provided the police with a statement in which he said that Bond drank at the Manhattan Hotel in 1994 and would have known Elisabeth. This wasn't welcome news to Bond, who snapped, "You shouldn't have said anything about her. Fucking hell." The friend reassured Bond that he had nothing to worry about, but this did little to quell the panic in Bond's voice. "I know, but fucking hell," he said. "All because of fucking rumours, mate. It shits me up the wall." On Wednesday, January 16, 2008, detectives summoned 41-year-old Shane Bond to the Kalgoorlie police station for a formal interview. He was casually dressed in a black singlet with a pair of sunglasses on his head as he sat down and was asked to tell the detectives everything he knew about the Elisabeth Membrey case, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Speaking calmly, Bond said all he knew was what he'd heard on the news. He said that he used to drink at the Manhattan Hotel, mostly on the weekends, and that he might have met Elisabeth once, but he wasn't there on the night she was last seen alive. He also admitted to owning a white Datsun at the time. One of the detectives then asked Bond point blank whether he had murdered Elisabeth. "No, I didn't," Bond replied defensively. Asked why they should believe him, he responded, "1, because I didn't do it. 2, I might have known her as a barmaid once or twice, but that's it." Bond denied that he'd ever come home covered in blood or that he'd fled Melbourne in the days after Elisabeth's disappearance. Asked about the claims that he'd been hassling Elisabeth at work before she went missing, Bond became visibly exasperated. "This is getting beyond a joke," he mumbled. "I didn't do it." After 56 minutes of questioning, Bond was released without charge. But the police were not ready to give up. While Shane Bond remained the police's #1 suspect, they still weren't ready to arrest him. Their investigations continued, and in 2008, they spoke to a retired detective named John Wilde, who claimed he had information that had been ignored for years. According to John, he had visited the Manhattan Hotel on the night of Tuesday, December 6, 1994, and had witnessed an unsettling incident involving Elisabeth Membrey. While John wasn't a regular at the Manhattan, he recognized Elisabeth because she had lived near him as a teenager and he often saw her walking to school. On the night in question, John claimed that he'd overheard Elisabeth speaking to a man in the gaming room. John initially thought the man was a bouncer as he was tall and looked like a bodybuilder. Things sounded friendly at first, with Elisabeth greeting the man with a hello. But after a while, John noticed that the two appeared to be arguing. Although he couldn't hear what they were saying, their facial expressions and body language suggested something was amiss. At one point, John said he saw the man grab Elisabeth by the wrists. A short while later, he grabbed her again, and Elisabeth tried to pull away from him. John said that the pair left the gaming room together at around midnight, with one of them walking in front of the other. John claimed that he'd called Crime Stoppers to report this interaction at least 10 times over the years, and that he'd even reached out to the homicide squad directly, but no one had ever taken a statement. By 2010, the investigation into Elisabeth's suspected murder had been going on for more than 15 years. Over that time, searches for her body had been conducted around the King Lake and Sylvan areas, in bushland near Healesville, and in disused mineshafts around the Warrandy area. Not a single clue had been found. The police still didn't have any DNA, CCTV footage, confessions, eyewitness accounts, covert surveillance, or anything concrete to tie Shane Bond to the crime. But they did have statements from at least 10 witnesses alleging that he had implicated himself in Elisabeth's disappearance. By April that year, Bond had left the mining industry and was back in Victoria. Despite the lack of physical evidence, police decided it was time to make their move. On Tuesday, April 20, they visited Bond at his home in Don Valley and placed him under arrest for the murder of Elisabeth Membrey. It was the news the Membreys had been anxiously waiting for. They hoped Bond's arrest would bring them one step closer to finding their daughter's body so they could give her the dignity of a proper burial. But sitting across from Bond in court as he was formally charged for Elisabeth's murder and watching him deny involvement was a traumatic experience in itself. Speaking about the experience to The Age afterwards, Joy said, "You don't cope, you manage. It's literally a day-by-day situation dealing with normality. It's almost impossible, but you just have to find some means of coping." Detective Vittles acknowledged the sheer number of police who had worked on the investigation to bring it to this conclusion, telling reporters, "Every case that we take on is personal. In our office, we have a motto, and that is, failure is never an option. I'm relieved that after 15 and a half years, that we've finally reached this stage." Shane Bond's trial commenced in the Supreme Court of Victoria in February 2012. Pre-trial hearings had barred any mention of his criminal record or history of violence against women. The lead prosecutor told the jury that despite the lack of a body, it was beyond reasonable doubt that Elisabeth Membrey had been murdered. They painted Shane Bond as having been fixated on Elisabeth and said he was the person seen arguing with Elisabeth at the pool and in her driveway on the day she was killed. Feeling rejected by her, he went to her home in the middle of the night where he attacked her, wrapped her body in her doona, and then dumped her at an unknown location before attempting to clean the crime scene. The prosecution said that Bond then fled the state, seeking medical attention for an unknown issue before returning to Melbourne once he thought it was safe to do so. Over the years, he repeatedly implicated himself in the crime by making comments of varying degrees to numerous people. But Bond's defense team criticised the fully circumstantial case, pointing out that the prosecution had failed to uncover a single piece of physical evidence to tie Bond to the crime. They presented the initial police interview with Bond, conducted 2 weeks after Elisabeth went missing, during which the detective explicitly remarked that Bond looked nothing like the suspect sketch of the man seen arguing with Elisabeth. Additionally, Bond's obvious acne scars hadn't been mentioned by any of the witnesses. The defense argued that the only thing tying Bond to the crime was the incriminating statements he'd allegedly made over the years, pointing out that these were put forward by people years after the fact. Furthermore, the defense suggested some of these so-called witnesses had been influenced by various factors, such as ongoing rumours and gossip, a desire to claim the $1 million reward, and personal vendettas against Shane Bond. They argued that there had been other suspects over the years, namely Bruce Simpson and Luke Ford, who also had criminal records. Based on the available evidence, these men could have just as easily been responsible. For legal reasons, the jury weren't told that these other suspects had already been thoroughly investigated and cleared by police. This left the defense free to present circumstantial evidence that implicated an offender other than their client. It wasn't their intention to suggest that one of these men was guilty. They simply wanted to show how a circumstantial case could just as easily be built against one of them. Each of the witnesses who'd implicated Bond had their motives and reliability called into question by the defense during cross-examination. The former mining workmates were asked why they never bothered to query Bond further on the alleged admissions he'd made about Elisabeth during drinking sessions. One was asked why he only came forward after he and Bond fell out over a work issue. It was also shown that this witness had added more incriminating details to his story as time went by. When it came to Rochelle, the woman who alleged Elisabeth had complained that Bond was hassling her, the defense pointed out that there was no evidence to prove this conversation ever happened. Rochelle hadn't even talked about it to a friend. If it did occur, the defense asked Rochelle why she hadn't come forward until years later, and only when the $1 million reward was announced. Rochelle said she had been young at the time and hadn't understood the law. She said it was only after Bond became a suspect that she started to think the encounter could hold significance, remarking, "I didn't know what was relevant. I didn't put 2 and 2 together. Call me stupid." John Wilde, the retired detective who testified to having seen Elisabeth arguing with a man in the Manhattan Hotel's gaming room on the night she was last seen alive, admitted on the stand to having issues with his mental health, as did the woman who testified that Bond had defaced newspaper pictures of Elisabeth Membrey. As for Bond's former housemate who claimed that Bond had come home on the night of the crime covered in blood, the defense argued there were numerous reasons why the jury should question his reliability. Not only was it known that the housemate held animosity towards Bond, but he also struggled with substance and alcohol use, which could have damaged his memory. A former colleague of this man said that he'd once remarked, "My head was that fucked from drugs and grog that I started to wonder whether I did it." During the 8-week trial, the defence also called other suspects in the case to the stand in a bid to prove that there was just as much circumstantial evidence to implicate them as there was to implicate Bond. In closing arguments, the prosecution told the jury to discount any other suspects, saying that the investigation had been flawed from the start because the police initially had tunnel vision on Bruce Simpson. The only person responsible, the prosecution concluded, was Shane Bond. They also told the jury that if they believed the story that Bond allegedly told a mining buddy about a bartender fatally hitting her head on a coffee table, they could also consider the charge of manslaughter. The defence reminded the jury that after hearing from 76 witnesses and seeing exhibits from both legal teams, what happened to Elisabeth still remained a mystery. The fact is, Bond's lawyer said, very little is known about what happened to Elisabeth Membrey in the unit on that night. Virtually nothing is known about how she died or indeed why she died. In those circumstances, it is simply not possible to be satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt of the guilt of the accused. They said it was a more reasonable possibility that Elisabeth's killer still hadn't been found, and that the answers lay with whoever the man was seen arguing with Elisabeth on the day she disappeared. We don't know who it is, and we can't work out who it is, Bond's lawyer said. But there is a real possibility that this person has not come forward because they were involved in the killing of Elisabeth Membrey. When the jury retired to deliberate, nobody expected a quick decision. But as the days continued to tick by with no verdict, it became abundantly clear just how torn the jury was. 8 days later, they were finally ready. On Saturday, April 28, 2012, the jury announced their verdict regarding Shane Bond's involvement in Elisabeth Membrey's death. Not guilty. Bond sobbed as the verdict was read aloud. After being acquitted of all charges, he quickly left the court, surrounded by family members who'd been supportive throughout the entire process. Roger and Joy Membrey were crushed. It was difficult for them to think that the police had failed by not targeting Bond more aggressively in the early days in favour of chasing other suspects. Outside court, they faced reporters bleary-eyed, with Joy saying through tears, "It's not the end. We're not giving up. Something will happen, I hope, for Elisabeth and other women out there who aren't safe." But it wasn't just the verdict that left the Membreys reeling. They'd found the entire trial painful because of both the subject matter and the way they were treated. They had been given no special rights in the court. They weren't allowed to examine the evidence like Bond and his family were, and they weren't given any of the court papers, forensic photos or transcripts that the jury, members of the press and others were given access to. This meant that many times when a certain subject was being discussed, the Membreys couldn't even understand or follow along. They had also been warned not to bring any attention to themselves, and because of that, they felt like their every move was being scrutinised. One detective even snapped at them when they unintentionally arrived late one day because their bus had been stuck in traffic. Overall, they felt that the process had very little to do with Elisabeth, and that they had been treated like their presence was a nuisance. Roger later told a journalist for the Canberra Times, "It was just pathetic, the whole thing." Joy agreed, saying, "There needs to be change. We felt like we were in a horror movie." By 2014, the Membreys weren't any closer to the answers they'd been waiting 20 years for. Since Shane Bond's trial, changes had been made to Victoria's double jeopardy laws, which meant that he could be tried for Elisabeth's murder again if new and compelling evidence emerged. However, nothing had yet been forthcoming. Even though Bond was acquitted, Because someone had been charged and put to trial, the investigation was no longer considered active. Unless a breakthrough piece of evidence emerged, it was likely that Elisabeth's murder would languish in the cold case files alongside roughly 280 other unsolved homicide cases in Victoria. To mark the 20-year anniversary of Elisabeth's disappearance, Roger and Joy spoke to the ABC about their experience. "We're left up in the air," Joy said. "We've got no body. We don't know why, how, or where. So the anxiety is extreme all the time, the not knowing." But the Membreys made it very clear that they'd never give up their quest for the truth. "You can't," Roger said. "It's a hole in your heart you can't just paper over. It's our beloved daughter." The Membreys urged anyone with information to contact Crime Stoppers, reiterating that it wasn't too late. Wanting at least one positive thing to emerge from their ordeal, the Membreys joined a 2014 inquiry to investigate whether victims of crime and their families should be allowed to be more involved with the criminal process. Roger and Joy detailed their negative experience at Bond's trial for the Victorian Law Reform Commission. Along with submissions from 40 other relevant parties, it became part of a 328-page report released in 2016 titled "The Role of Victims of Crime in the Criminal Trial Process." This aimed to transform Australia's justice system by strengthening victim rights and fostering a more respectful, inclusive culture. By this point, the Membreys were in their 70s and the clock was ticking on their desire to obtain answers for their daughter before it was too late. Speaking to The Age about their push to get the case reinvestigated, Roger said, "I am 76 years old and we desperately want to find the truth for Elisabeth. We will not be on this earth forever. There is a sense that we have failed her. We are caught in this sort of half-life." In 2017, the police agreed to review the evidence in Elisabeth's case one more time. And they noticed that there were several lines of inquiry that hadn't been fully investigated when it came to one particular person of interest. Andrew Crump, the brother of Elisabeth's housemate, had come up early in the investigation. There were certain factors that made him suspicious, such as the fact that he'd unexpectedly left Melbourne 10 days after Elisabeth went missing, and that he'd mentioned having to fill in a hole for his boss before he left the state. Then there were the strange comments he'd allegedly made to friends and family over the years, including that he was at the unit on the night Elisabeth was killed and he knew where her body was. Despite previous allegations of stalking and breaking and entering, the police had mostly dismissed Andrew Crump as a person of interest in Elisabeth's case, putting his comments down to attention-seeking. But when they reviewed the case file in 2017, they realised that certain factors might have been overlooked. When they'd first questioned Crump back in 1994, he said the last time he had gone to Elisabeth's unit was a week or two before she went missing, when he stopped by to see his sister, but she hadn't been at home. Crump claimed that Elisabeth had let him in so that he could use the toilet and make a phone call. Looking back, police realised the potential significance of this story. Among the only items missing from Elisabeth's unit following her disappearance were the toilet roll holder and toilet paper. It occurred to them that Crump could have fabricated the story about using the toilet inside the unit so there would be a reasonable explanation for why his fingerprints or DNA might be at the crime scene. Then there was his claim that he had once had to move Elisabeth's car because it was blocking his sister's vehicle, a claim which his sister denied. The police wondered if this too could be a way to justify the presence of his DNA inside the vehicle. Back in October 2009, Andrew Crump had voluntarily provided a DNA sample to be tested against cigarette butts found in Elisabeth's car. His DNA didn't match, and the sample he provided had since been destroyed. However, in 2011, Crump's DNA had been obtained for a second time after he was accused of raping and assaulting his former partner in Queensland. He was convicted of those charges and sentenced to 4 years in prison, and his DNA was subsequently entered into a national database. In 2018, Victoria Police requested that Crump's DNA sample be tested against all of the samples taken from the Elisabeth Membrey crime scene. A sample taken from the driver's side seat cover and another from an apparent bloodstain on the driver's side door revealed some unexpected results. While both of the samples contained Elisabeth's DNA, they also contained DNA from someone else. Andrew Crump. While this was a major discovery for the police, it still wasn't the smoking gun they needed to make an arrest. The DNA profile on the driver's side seat cover only showed that Crump was 52 times more likely to be a contributor than a random Caucasian member of the Australian population. It also contained a DNA profile from a third unidentified person. In forensic biology, this was considered a relatively low likelihood ratio. As for the blood sample on the door, it was determined that Crump was 2,300 times more likely to be the contributor than a random Caucasian member of the Australian population. While this held a stronger likelihood ratio, it still wasn't conclusive enough to prove Crump's guilt. To strengthen their case, the police tried to verify certain assertions that Crump had made over the years. They tracked down Frank, the former friend who joined Crump on his impromptu move to Queensland in December 1994. The police first spoke to Frank in 2003, which was when he told them that Crump said he'd had to fill in a hole for his employer before leaving Melbourne. This time, Frank confirmed his previous story, but added another detail. According to Frank, as they were driving out of Melbourne, Crump drove past Elisabeth's unit on Bedford Road. In Frank's view, this was strange. It wasn't the most direct route, and he could see no reason for it. The police then spoke to Andrew Crump's parents. Both of them confirmed that Crump had been living with them in December 1994, but given the passing of time, neither could recall whether he had been home on the night of Tuesday, December 6. However, there was one detail that police found significant. In contrast to Crump's previous claim that he'd last stopped by the Bedford Road unit a week or two before Elisabeth went missing, his mother had a different story. She said that Crump had gone to the unit a few days before Elisabeth's disappearance, on Sunday, December 4, and Elisabeth had refused to let him inside. Convinced that the killer could have been staring them in the face all along, the police wanted to proceed with charges against Andrew Crump. They prepared a brief of evidence which they presented to the Office of Public Prosecutions for consideration. While all this was going on, Roger Membrey was battling dementia. Joy Membrey told journalist John Sylvester that her husband sometimes walked around the ward he was in, cradling a picture of Elisabeth and crying. By the time the Membreys were told about the breakthrough, Roger was too ill to understand, and after reviewing the evidence, the OPP declined to press charges anyway. Not only did they think that the evidence fell short of what would be required to secure a conviction, for reasons that haven't been made publicly available, it was also deemed unlikely that Crump would be found mentally fit to stand trial. On Monday, February 6, 2023, Roger Membrey passed away at the age of 83 without the answers he'd spent almost 30 years fighting for. Joy told The Age, I just hope he is up there and is reunited with our daughter. On the same day that Roger passed away, Victoria Police made an application to set aside the findings of the 2000 coroner's inquest into Elisabeth Membrey's death on the basis that there were new facts and circumstances pursuant to the case. Namely, that further investigations had identified a person who may have contributed to her death. Based on the strength of the new material provided, Coroner John Kane agreed that it was appropriate to reopen the investigation. In October that year, he granted a second inquest, which was scheduled to take place in 2025. The inquest would involve Judge Kane reviewing all the evidence presented at the 2000 inquest, along with the new evidence uncovered during the latest re-investigation. Andrew Crump himself was not legally obliged to give evidence at the inquest, but on Sunday, April 27, 2025, he did provide a statement to the Queensland Police at the coroner's request. Crump stated that he did not remember the last time he had seen Elisabeth, and he couldn't recall if he saw her on December 6, 1994. He agreed it was possible that he might have seen Elisabeth when his sister wasn't at the unit, but denied that there was ever any romantic relationship between them. Asked about the incriminating statements he had allegedly made to others about Elisabeth's death, he denied ever saying such things, and flatly rejected the suggestion that he could have harmed Elisabeth. Overall, nothing was uncovered by the Queensland Police that opened any new lines of inquiry. The inquest also scrutinised the DNA evidence that supposedly connected Andrew Crump to Elisabeth's car. Judge Kane found that the two DNA profiles were of too low a likelihood ratio to be considered compelling. He also took issue with the fact that the sample on the car seat provided a third DNA profile from an unidentified individual. Furthermore, he found it significant that despite extensive testing, none of Crump's DNA was found inside Elisabeth's unit. After reviewing all of the available evidence, Judge Kane handed down his findings on Wednesday, July 2, 2025. He stated that there was much evidence to justify the police attention being focused on Andrew Crump and accepted their conclusion about Crump's involvement in Elisabeth's death. However, the coroner stated, "I have concluded that the evidence falls just short of the coronial standard of proof, and I am therefore unable to find that Mr. Crump caused or contributed to the death of Ms. Membrey. There are many gaps in the evidence of Mr. Crump's movements and activities on 6 and 7 December 1994. There are many inconsistencies and some contradictory aspects to the evidence. This, combined with the DNA evidence being at best inconclusive, has persuaded me to come to the conclusion that I have." Like the coroner before him, Judge Kane agreed that Elisabeth Membrey had died at her unit on December 7, 1994 from an unknown cause. He had no further comment beyond that. Unless any significant new evidence emerged, Judge Kane reiterated that this latest inquest would be the final hearing. He acknowledged the pain of Elisabeth's loved ones, stating, "Ms. Membrey's family, in particular her mother, and prior to his death, her father, have suffered unimaginable grief and anguish over the last 30 years through the criminal investigation, criminal trial, and now 2 coronial investigations with no answers and no closure. It is regrettable that I have not been able to provide the closure that Ms. Membrey's family would want, but the evidence simply does not support a conclusion other than the one I have come to. I convey my sincere condolences to Miss Membrey's family for their loss." Joy Membrey was baffled. With no recommendation of charges being laid against Andrew Crump, this effectively meant that the investigation into his possible involvement had run its course. 85-year-old Joy told Judge Kane his decision was unfair. Convinced that the police had finally found the killer, Joy said, "I cannot live another few years not knowing what happened with my daughter. All I want out of life is my daughter found. I want justice for Elisabeth. That's all I want." But Judge Kane reiterated his decision and said the inquest would be the final stage of the investigation unless any new and compelling evidence emerged. If there were any positives for Joy to take away from the experience, it was that, unlike Shane Bond's trial, she felt she was treated with warmth and compassion this time around. Outside the coroner's court, Joy told reporters that she intended to give up for the time being, adding, "But you never say die." As of May 2026, Elisabeth Membrey's body still hasn't been found. Andrew Crump denies any involvement in her death and has never been charged with her murder or with any other offences related to her disappearance. Casefile acknowledges his presumption of innocence. Shane Bond has been acquitted of all charges and denies any involvement with Elisabeth's disappearance, and Casefile does not suggest otherwise. In the years following his trial, Bond has spoken about how the allegations against him and the subsequent media attention ruined his life. According to an article in the Herald Sun, Bond struggled to find work because of his association with the case. He began using methamphetamine and moved around the country in the hopes of finding anonymity. After Bond was hit with unrelated driving and dishonesty charges in 2016, Detective Ron Iddles told the Sydney Morning Herald, "I know of cases where the worst thing to happen to an accused is an acquittal." The $1 million reward for information that leads to the conviction of Elisabeth's killer is still available. Anyone with information relating to the case is encouraged to contact Crime Stoppers on 1-800-333-000 or submit a confidential report online at crimestoppersvic.com.au. Despite the years of disappointment and heartache Roger and Joy Membrey endured, reporters who spoke to them always observed how their faces lit up whenever they spoke about Elisabeth. They described her as everything they'd ever wanted from a daughter and said that the day she was born was the happiest day of their lives. They would not stop fighting for her because if the tables were turned, they knew she would not stop fighting for them. "We loved her dearly. She was a dear daughter, and we miss her terribly," Roger once told The Age. "We are very grateful for the years that we had with her, but we're also very disappointed and very angry that we don't have more years with her." In 2005, Roger told John Sylvester that they feared that who Elisabeth was as a person would become overshadowed by the mystery of her case. "People really liked her," Roger said. "She had this magnetic personality. She was pretty and elegant and had a quiet presence. Even when I just walked into a shopping centre with her, I would walk a little taller."